Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we're continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and the Ukraine. Now, today there has been a fairly significant breakthrough by Russian forces. The breakthrough in question, as we'll kind of zoom in on our map here, is within the vicinity of New York. Now, I don't know the backstory on the naming of this town. Maybe a listener can comment and give us a quick debrief on the naming of this town and why it is named such. But the Russians have broken through this area. This was a heavily fortified area by the Ukrainians that was trying to, obviously, to prevent further Russian breakthroughs. Now, the Russians have broken through towards the south by southwest quadrant near New York, and they also continue a pressure campaign near Sumy as well. And that advance is continuing, and they're looking right now to penetrate the main Ukrainian defensive lines around the city of Torsk, this area here. This is a fairly urbanized area with different small towns and cities. There are old, both single-family homes and many older style Soviet apartment blocks as well, combined with some fairly heavy foliage and forests located in this area. So we're seeing some very intense close quarters combat taking place, massive amounts of heavy artillery, specifically the Russians using just massive amounts of heavy artillery and guided glide bombs as well in their ongoing efforts to break through the Ukrainian lines. Now, because of these strikes, we are now seeing in some of these advances by the Russians, we're seeing an additional $2 billion in emergency aid being granted to the Ukrainians. This will entail the handing over of advanced air defense weapon systems, Patriot, NASAMS, and much more guided anti-tank weapons as well is needed by the Ukrainian military. And this is going to come from U.S. drawdown. So essentially, the U.S. is going to go into its stockpiles of existing weapon systems, grab those existing weapon systems that should be used for the U.S. military, and hand those weapon systems over to the Ukrainians. Now, the idea is that the actual $2 billion will then be used by the United States to repurchase weapon systems for our own stockpiles. But the problem is there are allies that are also demanding these weapon systems, such as Taiwan, countries in Western Europe. There are all these contracts that have been signed for these varying weapon systems, and unfortunately the U.S. may be the last military to actually be able to restockpile its weapon systems by handing over these existing stockpiles of weapons to the Ukrainians. Okay? Now, this article I want to read is out of VOA Voice of America. NATO summit to unveil concrete steps for Ukraine's membership. Now remember, look, at the onset of this conflict, NATO, the United States, Western Europe was kind of given the wink, wink, wink. Ukraine will never be part of NATO. Russia, you have nothing to worry about. Wink, wink. NATO will never be part of NATO. Now, obviously, we're going to enter into some military arrangements with the Ukraine, but they won't actually be part of NATO. Will their military forces have the same capabilities as an interoperable status as NATO forces? Yeah, absolutely, but that doesn't mean they're part of NATO. Wink, 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 right? Just the same as in the early 90s, during the collapse of the Soviet Union. NATO has no desire to proceed east of what is now East Germany. NATO has no interest in moving into Poland, Romania, Hungary, no interest at all. And we weren't even talking about moving into the actual former Soviet states such as Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Georgia, what have you. Now the Ukraine. And Ukraine is that red line for the Russians. You can overplay your hand. Okay? You can overcommit to a strategy and make a strategic blunder. And this is what the West has done in regards to Russia. So here, the article continues. NATO will roll out concrete ways to accelerate Ukraine's eventual membership in the Atlantic Alliance during a summit next week in Washington, according to a senior U.S. official. It's probably one of those senior U.S. officials actually running the country while Joseph Biden walks around the White House defecating himself in the nude. Yeah. Summit organizers are understood to be leaning towards language in a final declaration that would say Ukraine's path to NATO is irreversible. Ukraine's path to NATO is irreversible. Well, I hate to break their bubble, but someone should probably tell the Russians. I tell you. But the official would say only that the wording is still being negotiated. Douglas Jones, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, told VOA during an interview on Tuesday that foreign ministers from 35 non-NATO member partners are invited to attend the Washington summit. Notable attendees include foreign ministries of Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. For the third consecutive summit, heads of state from all 32 NATO allies will engage in discussions with leaders from its Indo-Pacific partners, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand. Building the resilience of allies to confront threats and challenges from China is among the key agenda items, said Jones. But he added, a proposal to establish a NATO liaison office in Tokyo. A NATO liaison office in Tokyo. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization in Tokyo. Intended as a hub for cooperation with Australia, Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand, is currently not under active discussion. Right. In celebration of NATO's 75th anniversary, more than 24 influencers have been invited to observe the proceedings and create social media content to commemorate the milestone. I was not invited. The following excerpts from the interview have been edited for brevity and clarity. And it kind of goes on. Again, actively looking at bringing in or trying to bring in or trying to find a way through the legalese of the NATO Charter to bring in the Ukraine. Yep, so very interesting. So, again, as we speak, this Russian offensive continues from Sumy down just south of New York. There has been a breakthrough at multiple points in this area as well, breaking through the Ukrainian lines. Now, what I also wanted to talk about real quick was, let's say hypothetically, again, we're trying to see this from, obviously, the Russian point of view, right? You have to look at your adversary's point of view. Why are they fighting? Why do they want to fight? What is happening? Now let's hypothetically say that for whatever reason the Russians would desire to establish a very large dual-purpose base, a very large radar system that would be equipped with the most advanced Russian air defense systems on the planet. Let's say the S-500. Cuba was going to authorize the Russians to build an over-the-horizon radar station equipped with S-500 missiles and the capability to launch Caliber cruise missiles, to launch ground-launched cruise missiles with in excess of a 1,200-mile range, in which that would mean they could hit targets all through the United States with tactical nuclear-tipped cruise missiles. What would the United States do? Do you remember the Bay of Pigs? Do you remember the Cuban Missile Crisis? The United States disallowed the Russians to place these weapon systems in Cuba. Now, as I've talked about before, if we were to go back in history and we were to tell the Russians that NATO is actually going to expand into Poland, it's going to expand into Romania. Matter of fact, we're going to put a missile base. We're going to put a missile base in Romania. We're going to put something called the Aegis Ashore missile base that could theoretically be equipped with Tomahawk cruise missiles with a range of in excess of 1,200 miles, capable of striking Moscow. We're going to put the most advanced air defense missiles on the planet at this missile base as well in Romania. Do you think things would have happened the way they occurred during the collapse of the Soviet Union? Do you think the Soviet Union would have reevaluated leaving Eastern Europe? Would, in fact, the Warsaw Pact have collapsed? Probably things would look a lot differently if they knew about this missile base. So again, you have to look at it from your adversary's point of view. On one hand, the United States is saying, look, Russia, you can't put missiles in Cuba. But on the other hand, the United States feels it has the ability, the political capital to simply put missile systems in the former Soviet sphere. Now, again, we're talking about the Ukraine becoming part of this military alliance. And this puts the possibility of Aegis Ashore weapon systems even much closer to Moscow. So this is why the Russians have drawn this red line in the Ukraine. Not only that, again, many would argue that large parts of the Ukraine are Russian. I would argue that all territory east of the Dnieper River and Kiev is traditionally part of Russia. And I base this on history. History. You have to look at that. So again, you go back to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and you look at the language that was articulated to the Russians in terms of what NATO was not going to do, and you look at where NATO is today. It's that whole Overton window concept. What was insane becomes reasonable. So what would be insane now could become reasonable in the future. And again, many of the body politic here in the West, the ultimate goal is to see the actual Russian Federation fractured and become a multitude of states. A multitude of states. And the Russians are having none of that. And that is why we are in the situation we are in now. So again, this is where you overstretch your hand. This is how world wars start. And right now we are gravitating towards that world war. We're heading in that direction. We have pushed the Russians into the bed of the Chinese. That is going to create the largest military alliance in history. And that sets the stage. And we continue to see articles and the push towards the creation of a Ukrainian entity that becomes part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the Russians are not going to allow it. They're not going to allow it. The Ukrainians, or the regime that controls the Ukraine at this point, is still desiring to join NATO. And the Russians are not going to allow it. And this war is going to continue. And it will probably escalate. The Russians are not going to allow it. The Russians will use nuclear weapons against the Ukrainians in the West before they allow Ukraine, the borderlands, to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And given the history of Russia, going back to World War I, World War II, they have had a completely different life experience than we have had here in the United States. Here in the United States, we do not share long borders with potential aggressor states. We have not been physically invaded since the War of 1812. The Russians have had a multitude of experiences with border nation states invading their country and killing millions of their people. It's their history. And that is why they are not going to stop this war. And in the end, they will probably be victorious. And if they're not victorious, we're probably heading towards a use of nuclear weapons. That's where we're heading. So breakthrough near New York, Torsk, other areas as well. There continues to be Russian ballistic missile attacks against Ukrainian military bases. They have destroyed a number of Western supply nodes in Western and Eastern Ukraine. And obviously the fighting continues. So more to come. Thank you for joining us. As always, have a good day.